The coldest day of my life was not in the middle of a New York winter. It was the rainy Sunday evening when my son, James, handed me a brochure for a senior living home and told me I had 30 days to pack my bags. He wanted my bedroom for his mother-in-law. James and his wife thought I was just a helpless old woman. They assumed the $275,000 I used to pay off their mortgage was a generous gift. They were wrong. So, very wrong. While they were busy redecorating my room, I was quietly activating the legal lien I had placed on the property years ago. Now, my phone is ringing off the hook. James is not arrogant anymore. He is frantic. He is begging. He realized too late that the house he was so eager to kick me out of actually belongs to me. Before I tell you how I watched them move their belongings into a tiny 2-bedroom rental, I would love to know, what city or state are you watching from today? Please leave a comment and say hello. Note: while this story is crafted for entertainment purposes, the message about protecting your financial independence and setting clear legal boundaries is very real and very important for all of us. They say that home is where the heart is. For 40 years, my heart lived in a small saltbox colonial house on a quiet street in a suburb of Ohio. It was the house where my husband, Arthur, and I raised our only son, James. Every scratch on the hardwood floors and every faded patch on the wallpaper told a story. It was our sanctuary. But after Arthur passed away 3 years ago, the house began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a museum of things I no longer had. The silence in those hallways was deafening. I would find myself sitting in Arthur's old leather recliner, staring at the empty spaces where his laughter used to be. It was during one of these long, lonely afternoons that James came to visit. He sat across from me, his eyes full of a concern that I now realize was perhaps something else. He talked about the future. He talked about how hard it was for a woman of 72 to maintain a big yard and a drafty house alone. He told me, "Mom, you shouldn't be here by yourself. Kimberly and I want you with us. We want Sophie to grow up knowing her grandmother. We want to be a real family again." My heart swelled at those words. Is there anything more a mother wants to hear? To be wanted, to be needed, to be part of the lives of the people she loves most in the world. James and Kimberly had a beautiful home, but they were struggling. The economy was tough, and their mortgage was a heavy weight on their shoulders. I made a decision that day. It was a decision born out of pure, unconditional love. I decided to sell my home. I decided to pack up 40 years of memories into cardboard boxes and walk away from the only life I knew. The sale went through quickly. After the fees were paid and the dust had settled, I was holding a check for $275,000. It was my entire life's work. It was Arthur's hard work. It was our retirement, our security, our everything. I remember the evening I sat James down at his kitchen table. I slid that check across the granite countertop. I told him, "James, I want you to use this. Pay off the mortgage. I want this house to be yours, free and clear. I want us to build a future here together, as a family." James looked at that check like it was a miracle. He hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. He thanked me over and over again, calling me the best mother a man could ever have. Even Kimberly was moved. She promised me that I would always have a place in their home. She said this was my house now, too. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt since Arthur's funeral. I thought I had done the smartest thing possible. I had secured my son's financial future, and in return, I had secured a place where I would never be lonely again. I thought I was investing in love. I thought I was buying a ticket to a happy ending. I didn't realize then that I was actually handing them the keys to my own destruction. I didn't see the tiny shift in the atmosphere. I was blinded by the joy of being a grandmother. I was 72 years old, and I truly believed that blood was thicker than water and that a mother's sacrifice would always be honored. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. The first year of living with James, Kimberly, and little Sophie felt like a dream. If you had asked me then, I would have told you it was the best decision I ever made. The house was always full of life. It smelled like coffee in the morning and laundry detergent in the afternoon. It was a stark contrast to the hollow silence of my old home. My days were filled with a beautiful, simple purpose. Every morning, I would wake up at 6 o'clock to start the day. I loved being the first one in the kitchen. I would flip golden pancakes for Sophie and pack her little lunchbox with extra care. I'd tuck a small note inside every single day, telling her how much her grandma Evelyn loved her. Those moments were like gold to me. James would come down, kiss my cheek, and grab his coffee. He seemed so much lighter now, that the burden of the mortgage was gone. The stress that used to sit on his shoulders had vanished. He would tell me how much he appreciated me. He'd say, "Mom, I don't know what we'd do without you." And I believed him. Kimberly was pleasant too. We spent afternoons together in the garden. I taught her how to prune the hydrangeas and when to plant the tomatoes. We talked about trivial things like recipes and neighborhood gossip. She seemed happy to have the extra help around the house. I did the grocery shopping. I folded the endless piles of laundry. I kept the house spotless while she and James worked their high-pressure jobs. I felt like the heartbeat of the home. I wasn't just a guest. I was a vital part of the machinery that kept their lives running smoothly. My favorite time of day was the late afternoon. I would wait at the front door for the yellow school bus to turn the corner. Sophie would come running off that bus, her backpack bouncing against her tiny shoulders, shouting for Grandma. We would spend hours at the kitchen table, her small hand in mine as I helped her with her spelling words. We would bake cookies and tell stories about her grandpa Arthur. I felt useful. At 72, that is a powerful feeling. In a world that often treats older people like they are invisible, I felt seen. I felt valued. I spent my own small social security checks on things for the house. A new rug for the living room. A set of high-quality swings for Sophie in the backyard. I wanted to contribute. I wanted to show them that I was still capable of giving. Everything felt stable. Everything felt permanent. I remember sitting on the back porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of violet and orange. I thought to myself, "Evelyn, you did it. You found your way through the grief. You found a way to be happy again." I had no idea that I was living on borrowed time. I didn't notice that Kimberly was starting to spend more time on the phone with her own mother in Florida. I didn't see the way she would look at my bedroom door when she thought I wasn't watching. To me, that room was my final port in the storm. To her, it was just square footage. It's funny how memories can play tricks on you. When I look back now, I try to find the moment the honey turned to vinegar. I try to find the first sign of the storm. But back then, I was too happy to see the clouds. I was too busy being a grandmother to realize that I had become a convenience, and that conveniences can always be replaced. They say that change happens slowly, then all at once. For me, the change started with the small things. It was like watching a beautiful tapestry slowly unravel, one tiny thread at a time. After that first year of bliss, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. It wasn't a sudden storm. It was more like a cold fog that started to settle over everything. Kimberly, who used to be so warm and welcoming, started to become different. Her smiles didn't reach her eyes anymore. She began to make little comments, small, sharp remarks that felt like paper cuts. They weren't enough to start a fight over, but they stung just the same. It started in the living room. I had brought my favorite wingback chair from my old house. It was Arthur's favorite chair. It was comfortable, covered in a soft burgundy velvet, and it held so many memories. One afternoon, I came downstairs to find Kimberly staring at it with her arms crossed. She didn't look at me. She just said, "Evelyn, don't you think this room is getting a bit cluttered? This chair is so large. It doesn't really match the new modern look we want for the house. It's a bit of an eyesore, don't you think?" I felt a lump in my throat. I told her that it was the only piece of my old life I had left. I reminded her that I spent most of my evenings in that chair, reading to Sophie, but she just sighed and walked away, murmuring something about spatial flow. A week later, the chair was gone. James told me they had moved it to the basement to keep it safe. But I knew what it was. It was a message. My presence was beginning to take up too much space. Then there were the comments about Sophie. I had raised James to be a kind, respectful man. I thought I knew a thing or two about parenting. But suddenly, everything I did was wrong. If I gave Sophie a small piece of chocolate after dinner, Kimberly would snap. She would talk about sugar intake and structured boundaries. One afternoon I was helping Sophie with her math homework. She was struggling, and I was trying to explain it the way I had learned it. Kimberly walked in and hovered over us like a hawk. She said, "Evelyn, we use a different method now. You're just going to confuse her. Maybe it's better if I handle the schoolwork from now on. You should just go rest. Go rest." Those words felt like a dismissal. She was telling me I was obsolete. She was telling me my wisdom was no longer required in this house. The kitchen, which used to be our shared space, became Kimberly's private territory. If I tried to cook a Sunday roast, she would complain about the smell of heavy grease. If I reorganized the pantry to make things easier to find, she would put everything back the way it was the very next day. I started to feel like a ghost in my own home. And I call it my home, because in my mind, it still was. I was the one who had cleared the $275,000 debt. I was the one who had given them the freedom to live this life. But Kimberly acted as if I were a guest who had stayed far too long. James was caught in the middle. I could see the stress in his eyes. When I tried to talk to him about how I was feeling, he would just pat my hand and say, "Mom, you're just being sensitive. Kimberly is tired. Work is hard. Just give her some space." But the space was all I had left. I began to spend more and more time in my bedroom. I sat on the edge of my bed, surrounded by the few photos I had left of Arthur, and wondered, when did I stop being a mother and start being a burden? The cracks were there, deep and jagged, and I was the only one who seemed to realize that the whole house was about to come tumbling down. The real turning point came on a Tuesday in October. I remember the date because the leaves were just beginning to turn that brittle, dying brown. Kimberly had been on the phone for hours. I could hear her voice rising and falling through the vents in the floor. She was talking to her mother, Mrs. Burbage, who lived in a flashy condo down in Florida. Usually, their conversations were about shopping or the weather. But this time, it was different. I heard the word foreclosure. I heard the word penniless. Later that evening, the tension at the dinner table was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Kimberly was picking at her salad, her eyes red as if she had been crying. James was staring at his plate, looking completely defeated. Finally, Kimberly spoke. "Evelyn," she said, her voice trembling with a forced kind of sweetness. "My mother has had some terrible news. Her investments in Florida, well, they've collapsed. She's lost her condo. She has nowhere to go." My heart went out to her. I knew what it was like to lose a home. I started to say how sorry I was, but Kimberly cut me off. "She's coming here," Kimberly said. "She needs family right now. She's not well, and she can't be alone." I nodded slowly. I thought to myself, well, the guest room in the basement is a bit damp, but we can make it work. We can fix it up. But then Kimberly looked at James, and James looked at the floor. "The thing is, Evelyn," James began, his voice barely a whisper, "Mrs. Burbage can't stay in the basement. Her hips are bad. She can't do the stairs. She needs to be on the main floor. She needs a real room." The silence that followed was absolute. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. There was only one bedroom on the main floor besides the master suite. My bedroom. I looked from James to Kimberly. I waited for one of them to say they were joking. I waited for my son to stand up and say that his mother, the woman who had given him $275,000, would never be displaced. But he didn't say a word. For the next few days, the whispering started. It was the worst part of it all. I would walk into the kitchen, and they would suddenly stop talking. I would hear them in the hallway at night, their voices low and urgent. I heard Kimberly say, "It's only logical, James. My mother is family. Your mother. Well, she has her social security. She could be so much more social in one of those senior communities. She'd have friends her own age. It's better for everyone. Friends her own age. That is the phrase people use when they want to put you out of sight and out of mind. I felt like an intruder. Every time I walked past Mrs. Burbage's photo on the mantel, I felt like she was already there, claiming my space. Kimberly started bringing home brochures, not for cruises or vacations, but for assisted living facilities. She would leave them on the coffee table, right where I would see them. I realized then that I wasn't just a piece of the family anymore. I was a problem to be solved. I was an obstacle in the way of Kimberly's mother. I would sit in my room and look at the walls I had helped pay for. I thought about the $275,000. To them, that money was gone. It was a ghost. They had spent it, enjoyed the freedom it brought, and now they were ready to discard the person who gave it to them. The air in the house became heavy. It felt like I was breathing in charcoal dust. I felt smaller every day. I felt invisible. I realized that James was no longer the boy I had raised. He had become a man who was willing to trade his mother's dignity for his wife's approval. It was a bitter pill to swallow. But as I sat there, listening to them whisper about my transition into a senior home, a spark of my old self began to flicker. I remembered who I was before I became Grandma Evelyn. I remembered the woman who had spent 30 years navigating the complexities of property law. They thought I was an old woman who didn't understand the world. They thought I was a soft target. They were about to find out that while I may have a mother's heart, I also have a professional mind. And in the world of real estate, everything comes down to the fine print. It was a Sunday evening in late October. The kind of rain that only happens in the Midwest was drumming against the windows. It was a cold, relentless rain that turned the world grey. Usually, Sunday dinner was the highlight of my week. It was the one time we all sat together without the distractions of school or work. But that night, the pot roast tasted like cardboard. The carrots were soft, and the silence was heavy. James didn't look at me once during the entire meal. He kept his head down, focused on his plate, as if it held the secrets to the universe. Kimberly was the opposite. She was overly bright, chatting about Sophie's upcoming school play and how nice the new curtains looked in the foyer. But her voice had a sharp, nervous edge to it. It was the sound of someone who was trying too hard to pretend everything was normal. After dinner, I went up to my room to read. I wanted to escape the tension that was vibrating through the house. I sat in my small reading chair and tried to focus on my book, but the words just blurred together. I could hear the muffled sound of their voices in the kitchen below. They were arguing. Not a loud, screaming argument, but a quiet, desperate one. Then I heard the stairs creak. A knock came at my door. It was soft, tentative. I knew before I even answered that my life was about to change. James walked in. He looked tired. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. He stood by the door, refusing to sit down, as if he wanted to be ready to run at any moment. "Mom," he began. His voice was thick. "We need to talk. About Kimberly's mother. About the house." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I stayed silent. I wanted him to say the words. I wanted him to have the courage to say it to my face. He cleared his throat and looked at a spot on the wall just above my head. "You know Mrs. Burbage is coming next week. She's really struggling, Mom. Her health is worse than she told us. She can't do the stairs to the basement guest room. She needs a proper space. Somewhere she can feel at home." I looked around my room. It was filled with my things. My favorite lamp. The quilt Arthur's mother had made for us. The photos of James, when he was a little boy. "And where is she going to go, James?" I asked. My voice was steady, but my heart was racing. James finally looked at me, and I saw a stranger. "We've been looking at some places for you, Mom. Really nice places. Have you heard of the Oaks? It's that new senior living community downtown. It's luxury. They have a chef. They have a garden club. They even have a shuttle to the mall." I felt a wave of nausea. A senior living community. You want to put me in a home. It's not a home, Mom, he said, using his hands to emphasize his point. It's a lifestyle choice. Kimberly and we just think you'd be happier there. You wouldn't have to worry about cleaning or cooking. You'd be with people your own age. I have a home, I said, standing up. I have this home. The one I paid for. The one where I gave you $275,000 so you wouldn't lose it. Remember that, James? He flinched as if I had struck him. He looked down at his shoes. That's not fair, Mom. That money, that was a gift to help us. This is different. This is about family needs. Kimberly needs her mother close. We need the space for the new baby. The new baby. He had thrown that in there like a shield. Kimberly was pregnant again. And they were using that joy to justify my exile. It's not like we're throwing you out, James continued, his voice getting faster. It's just rearranging. That's all. We're just rearranging the living situation so everyone is taken care of. It's a logical move. Rearranging. That word echoed in my mind. He talked about me as if I were a sofa that didn't fit the decor anymore, as if I were a piece of clutter that needed to be moved to the attic. Rearranging. I looked at my son. The boy I had held when he had nightmares. The man I had supported through his first divorce and his job losses. I realized in that moment that my love had blinded me to his weakness. He wasn't a bad man, but he was a weak one, and weak men will always choose the path of least resistance. 30 days, James said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The Oaks has a room opening up in 30 days. We've already put down the deposit. The deposit. They hadn't even asked me. They had already decided my fate while I was downstairs folding their laundry. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just looked at him until he couldn't meet my gaze anymore. I see, I said quietly. You want me to leave. You want the room for Mrs. Burbage. And you want me to pay for my own exile at the Oaks. Mom, please don't be like this, he said, sounding like a child. It's for the best. For everyone. I think you should leave now, James, I said. He looked relieved. He practically bolted for the door. He thought he had won. He thought the hard part was over. He thought his mother was just going to fade away into a luxury apartment with a garden club and a shuttle bus. As the door closed behind him, I sat back down in my chair. The rain was still drumming against the glass. Rearranging. I whispered the word to myself. A cold, hard smile touched my lips. James and Kimberly had forgotten one very important thing. When I was 35 years old, I was one of the top real estate paralegals in the state. I spent my life reading the fine print that other people ignored. I spent my life making sure that every dollar was protected and every contract was airtight. When I gave James that $275,000, I didn't do it blindly. I did it with a mother's hope, but also with a professional's caution. I walked over to my closet and pulled out a small fireproof lockbox. I opened it and took out a single blue folder. Inside was a document that James had signed 3 years ago. He had signed it in a flurry of excitement, barely looking at the pages as he dreamt of his debt-free life. It was a promissory note, and it was secured by a deed of trust. In the eyes of the law, I wasn't just a guest in this house. I was the primary lien holder. If James wanted to rearrange our lives, then I was more than happy to help him. But he was about to find out that when you rearrange the pieces of a life, sometimes the whole structure collapses. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. The rain didn't sound so cold anymore. It sounded like a countdown. 30 days. That was more than enough time for a woman who knew the law to make her next move. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the air inside the house felt colder than ever. I hadn't slept a wink. I spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with James over and over again. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that word. Rearranging. It was such a clinical word. Such a heartless way to describe throwing your mother out of the home she had saved. I decided to try one last time. I wanted to believe that if I laid out the facts, if I showed them the sheer scale of what I had given, they would find their way back to their senses. I wanted to believe that my son was still in there somewhere, buried under the pressure of his life. I walked into the kitchen as Kimberly was making coffee. James was sitting at the island, staring at his laptop. Neither of them looked up. The silence was like a wall. "James," I said, my voice sounding older than I felt. "We need to talk about the $275,000. Kimberly stopped mid-pour. She didn't turn around, but I saw her shoulders stiffen. James slowly closed his laptop and finally looked at me. His expression wasn't one of guilt. It was one of annoyance. "What about it, Mom?" he asked. "That money was my life," I said, stepping closer to the table. "That was 40 years of Arthur's work and mine. I didn't just give you a few dollars for groceries. I paid off this entire mortgage. I gave you the security that most people spend 30 years trying to achieve. I did that so we could be a family. Together. I waited for a thank you. I waited for him to acknowledge that without me, they would likely be living in a cramped apartment. Instead, Kimberly turned around. She had a look of cold, calculated logic on her face. "Evelyn, you speak as if that money were a business transaction. You're his mother. Parents provide for their children. It's what you do. You had the money, and James needed help. Was he just supposed to struggle while you sat on a pile of cash?" I was stunned. A pile of cash. She made my retirement savings sound like greed. "It wasn't a pile of cash, Kimberly," I whispered. "It was my safety net. It was my independence." Kimberly shrugged, her voice dripping with a dismissive tone. "Well, you don't need a safety net when you have a family to look after you. And we are looking after you. We found you a lovely room at the Oaks. It's a very expensive facility. We're doing our part as children." I looked at James. "Is that what you think, too? That I was just doing my duty? That $275,000 is the entry fee for being allowed to see my granddaughter?" James sighed, a long, weary sound that made me feel like I was the one being difficult. "Mom, please. Let's not be dramatic. You helped us out. We're grateful. But that doesn't mean you get to dictate how we run our household for the rest of our lives. My mother-in-law needs help. She is family too. We're just trying to balance everyone's needs. Family needs. Balanced needs." It was in that moment that the last bit of hope I had for James finally died. I looked at the man sitting across from me. This was the boy I had taught to ride a bike. This was the man I had stayed up with, night after night, when he was going through his first divorce, telling him that everything would be okay because he always had me. Now, I realized that James had become a stranger. He had been hollowed out. Under Kimberly's influence, he had learned to see people as assets or liabilities, and I had moved from the asset column to the liability column the moment a more pressing need came along. He didn't see my sacrifice as an act of love. He saw it as a debt I owed him for the privilege of being his mother. The betrayal was a physical pain in my chest. It was sharper than the grief I felt when Arthur died. When Arthur died, I lost my partner. But today, I was losing my son. I was losing the legacy I thought I had built. I realized that Kimberly had been working on him for a long time. She had slowly convinced him that my presence was an intrusion. She had turned my kindness into a burden. She had made him believe that by putting me in a home, they were actually doing me a favor. They were so convinced of their own righteousness. They were so sure that I would just go quietly. After all, what could an old woman do? I had no house of my own. I had no husband to protect me. I had given away my only weapon, or so they thought. I looked at Kimberly's smug expression and James's cowardly gaze. I felt a coldness settle over me. It wasn't the coldness of despair. It was the coldness of a woman who has nothing left to lose. They wanted me to leave. They wanted the room. They wanted the $275,000 to stay in their equity while I lived out my days in a luxury facility downtown. "I understand," I said. My voice was no longer trembling. It was as hard as flint. James looked relieved. "I'm glad, Mom. I knew you'd see reason." We can start looking at packing services this weekend. No need, I said. I'll handle my own packing. I turned and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see their expressions of victory. I knew they were already planning how to paint my room for Mrs. Burbage. I went up to my room and locked the door. I sat at my desk and pulled out that blue folder once more. I looked at the promissory note. I looked at the signature James had scribbled 3 years ago. He thought he was signing a thank you note. He thought he was signing a formality, but I had worked in property law for 3 decades. I knew that in this country, love might be fickle, but a recorded lien is forever. They had forgotten that I wasn't just a mother. I was a creditor, and it was time to collect. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It was time to talk to my old friend Robert. Robert wasn't just a friend. He was one of the toughest real estate attorneys in the city. As the phone rang, I looked out the window at the garden I had tended. The garden I would soon be leaving. The pain of the betrayal was still there. It would always be there. But underneath it, a new feeling was growing. It was a sense of justice. James and Kimberly wanted to rearrange our lives. They wanted to see what happened when you moved the pieces around. Well, I was about to show them. There is a specific kind of silence that happens when you finally stop fighting. It is not the silence of defeat. It is the silence of a plan. That morning, after the bitter confrontation in the kitchen, I went back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed. I looked at my hands. They were trembling, but not from fear. They were trembling from the sheer force of the adrenaline beginning to course through my veins. For months I had been reactive. I had been hurt. I had been the mother, pleading for a scrap of respect. But that version of Evelyn died in the kitchen. The woman who remained was the one who had spent 30 years looking for loopholes. The woman who knew that in a court of law, emotions do not matter. Only evidence matters. Only the signature matters. A few hours later, I heard a knock on my door. It was James. I could tell he was nervous. He expected me to be packed in ice, or perhaps lying in bed with a cold compress, weeping. He expected me to beg for another week or another month. I opened the door and looked at him. I didn't let him in. I stood in the doorway, my face a mask of perfect professional calm. "Mom," he started, his voice wavering. "I just wanted to check in. I know this is hard. If you need more time to look at the oaks, we can talk about." I cut him off. Not with a shout, but with a quiet, steady voice. "No need, James. I have thought about what you and Kimberly said. You are right. Family needs are changing. I have decided to move out." James blinked. He looked confused. He was so prepared for a battle that he didn't know what to do with a surrender. "Oh. Well. That is. I am glad you understand, Mom. Truly. I will be gone in 3 days," I said. His eyes widened. 3 days? "Mom, you don't have to rush that much. We said 30 days. We want to help you pack. 3 days is enough," I replied. "I don't want to be a burden on Kimberly or the new baby any longer than necessary. I have already found a place. A small apartment across town. It is quiet. It is exactly what I need." I watched the relief wash over him like a physical wave. He actually stood up straighter. His shoulders dropped. He smiled, a genuine smile. The first one he had given me in months. He thought he had won. He thought he had navigated the most difficult part of his life and come out on top. He thought his mother was being reasonable at last. "That is great, Mom," he said, reaching out to pat my shoulder. I didn't flinch, but inside, I felt a cold stone where my heart used to be. "We can help you move. We can rent a truck." "No," I said firmly. "I have already arranged for a small moving crew. I want to do this my way." Quietly, James nodded, his mind already moving on to the next thing. "Well, if you are sure, Kimberly will be so happy. We can get Mrs. Burbage moved in by next weekend. It is going to be a fresh start for everyone." A fresh start. I wondered if he had any idea how right he was. For the next 48 hours, I was a whirlwind of silent efficiency. I didn't cry when I packed Arthur's old books. I didn't pause when I folded the clothes I had worn while playing with Sophie in the yard. I was methodical. I was precise. Kimberly stayed out of my way. She hovered in the hallways, watching me with a mixture of suspicion and glee. She couldn't believe it was happening this easily. She probably thought she was a genius for managing me so well. She would offer me tea or ask if I needed extra boxes, her voice dripping with that fake sugary concern that makes your skin crawl. I ignored it all. I was focused on the blue folder in my lockbox. I made 3 phone calls during those 3 days. The first was to my friend Robert, the attorney. I told him the situation. I told him I was moving out of the property. I told him it was time to file the papers. "Evelyn," he said over the phone, his voice deep and grave. "Are you sure? Once we record this notice of default, there is no going back. He is your son." "He was my son, Robert," I said, looking at the empty space where my wingback chair used to sit. "Now he is just a man living in a house that I paid for. A house he thinks he owns. Proceed with the filing. Give them the full 30 days as required by law." But not a second more. The second call was to a local moving company. I didn't need a big truck. I was only taking what was truly mine. The furniture I had bought myself. My personal records. My memories. I was leaving the refrigerator. I was leaving the high-end dishwasher I had paid for. I was leaving the brand new HVAC system I had installed last summer. They could keep the house. For now. The third call was to my bank. I had a small amount of savings left. Not much, but enough for a deposit on a clean, safe apartment in a part of town where no one knew my name. I felt a strange sense of excitement. It was the excitement of a soldier preparing for a long, necessary campaign. On the third day, the movers arrived. It took them less than 2 hours to clear out my room. James and Kimberly stood in the driveway, watching as the boxes were loaded. They looked like a young, successful couple from a magazine. Kimberly was glowing, her hand resting on her stomach. James had his arm around her. They looked happy. As I walked toward my car, James stepped forward. "Mom, let me give you some money for the first month's rent. We want to help." I looked at him. I looked at the house. I looked at the $275,000 of my life that was buried in those walls. "Keep your money, James," I said softly. "You are going to need it." He laughed, a small, awkward sound. "Always worrying, Mom. Don't worry about us. We are doing great. We will come to visit you at your new place next week. We can bring Sophie." "I would like that," I said. It was the only lie I told him. I got into my car and drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I knew exactly what was behind me. A house built on a foundation of betrayal. I arrived at my new apartment. It was small. 1 bedroom, 1 bath. A tiny kitchen with a window that looked out over a small park. It was quiet. It was peaceful. It was mine. I sat at my new kitchen table and opened the blue folder. I took out a pen. I wrote a short, simple letter. It wasn't a letter of anger. It wasn't a letter of sadness. It was a letter of business. I placed the letter inside a manila envelope. Alongside it, I placed the recorded promissory note and the notice of lien. James thought he was rearranging a bedroom. He didn't realize he had rearranged his entire financial existence. He had forgotten that in America, you can walk away from your mother, but you cannot walk away from secured debt. I had given him 3 years to be a son. Now, I was giving him 30 days to be a borrower. I felt a profound sense of calm. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was the one who had dropped it. I reached for my tea and watched the sunset through my new window. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was powerful. The game was just beginning. They say that when you retire, you leave your professional life behind. You put away the suits, you clear out the desk, and you become someone else. You become a gardener. You become a baker. You become a grandmother. James and Kimberly looked at me and saw a woman who only knew how to fold laundry and bake apple pies. They saw a woman who was easily managed. A woman who was, in their eyes, a little bit slow to understand the modern world. They forgot that for 32 years, I was one of the most meticulous real estate paralegals in the city of Columbus. I spent 3 decades sitting in mahogany-paneled offices, surrounded by stacks of paper that would make most people's heads spin. I had seen every trick in the book. I had seen families torn apart by greed. I had seen sons swindle their fathers and daughters leave their mothers in the cold. I knew how the world worked long before James was even a thought in my mind. Back when I sold my house and handed James that check for $275,000, I was a mother first. My heart was full of hope. But the paralegal in me, she was still there. She was whispering in the back of my mind. She was telling me that love is a beautiful thing, but a contract is a solid thing. I remember the day clearly. We were sitting in the kitchen of this very house. James was so excited. He was talking about all the things they could do once the mortgage was gone. He was talking about vacations, new cars, and college funds for Sophie. I had the paperwork ready. I didn't make a big deal out of it. I told him, James, honey, since this is such a large amount of money, my bank needs us to sign a few standard documents. It is just for their records. A formality to show where the money went, so the tax office doesn't come knocking. He didn't even blink. He was so blinded by the zeros on that check that he would have signed a confession for a crime he didn't commit. He scribbled his name on the lines I pointed to. He didn't read the fine print. People rarely do when they are getting something for free. But those documents weren't just for the bank. The first document was a promissory note. It stated in very clear legal language that the $275,000 was a private loan. It carried a modest interest rate. It stated that the loan was payable upon demand if certain conditions were not met. The second document was the real masterpiece. It was a deed of trust. I had taken that document down to the county recorder's office myself the very next day. I paid the filing fee, and I watched the clerk stamp it with the official seal. In the eyes of the law, that $275,000 was not a gift. It was a secured debt. I had placed a lien on that house. I was the primary lender. I held the keys to their financial kingdom, and they didn't even know it. I spent that Sunday night after the argument sitting at my small desk, looking at those papers. I ran my fingers over the official seal. It felt cool and hard under my touch. I felt a strange mixture of sadness. I was proud of the woman who had spent 30 years learning how to protect people from their own worst instincts. I wasn't just a grandmother being rearranged. I was a creditor who was about to call in a very large debt. I realized that James and Kimberly had built their entire lifestyle on a foundation of my money. They had the nice cars, the private school for Sophie, the expensive organic groceries. All of it was possible because they didn't have a mortgage payment. They thought they were successful. They thought they were winning at life. They didn't realize they were living on borrowed time. I stayed up until 3 a.m, drafting the formal notice of default. My hands didn't shake. My mind was clear. I was back in that mahogany office. I was back in a world where facts were facts, and signatures were final. James and Kimberly thought they were playing a game of checkers. They thought they could just move my piece off the board and be done with it. They didn't realize I was playing chess. And I had been planning my endgame from the very first move. Timing is everything in law, and it is everything in life. I knew I couldn't move out while James and Kimberly were home. I didn't want the drama. I didn't want the fake apologies or the awkward attempts to help me pack. I wanted to leave like a shadow in the night. I waited for the following Saturday. Every Saturday, James took Sophie to her soccer practice at the park, and Kimberly went to her favorite high-end grocery store across town. They were usually gone for at least 4 hours. That was my window. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, I saw their SUV pull out of the driveway. I watched from behind the curtain until they turned the corner. Then, I went to work. I had already contacted a small professional moving crew. I told them I needed speed and discretion. At 9:15, a plain white truck pulled up to the curb. There were no loud logos. No slamming doors. These men were professionals. I had spent the last 3 days packing my life into neat, labeled boxes. I didn't take much. I left the furniture that wouldn't fit in a small apartment. I left the kitchen gadgets I rarely used. I only took the things that had a soul. Arthur's books, my mother's china, the small rug from our first apartment. The movers worked in a silent rhythm. They carried my boxes down the stairs with a grace that I appreciated. I walked through the house one last time, making sure I hadn't left anything behind. I walked into the kitchen. It was spotless. I had spent the morning scrubbing the counters and cleaning out the refrigerator. I didn't want to leave them a mess. I wanted to leave them a house that felt empty. I wanted them to feel the silence I was leaving behind. I looked at the guest room. My room. It was already starting to look like Mrs. Burbage's room. Kimberly had already placed a new floral rug on the floor. She had put a vase of lilies on the dresser. They were so eager to erase me. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt I finished. I drove to my new apartment. It was located in a quiet, older neighborhood. It was a brick building with big windows and a small garden in the front. I had used the small savings I had tucked away from my Social Security over the years to pay the deposit and the first 2 months of rent. It was cozy. It smelled like beeswax and fresh air. It was small, yes, but every square inch of it belonged to me. There were no whispering voices in the hallway. There were no brochures for senior homes on the coffee table. I spent the afternoon unpacking. I put my books on the shelves. I hung the photo of Arthur by the window where the afternoon sun would hit it. I made my bed with the soft, lavender sheets I loved. By 4 o'clock, the apartment felt like home. I sat down at my small kitchen table and poured myself a glass of water. I looked at the time. James and Kimberly would be getting home soon. They would walk through the door, expecting to see me in the kitchen or out in the yard. They would see the empty room. They would see the lilies Kimberly had bought, sitting in a room that was now truly theirs. They would probably feel a sense of relief. They would probably open a bottle of wine and celebrate their new rearranged life. But then, they would walk into the kitchen. I had left one thing behind. It wasn't a box or a piece of furniture. It was a single white envelope, sitting right in the center of the kitchen island. Inside that envelope was a letter. It didn't say, "I hate you." It didn't say, "How could you?" It was a formal, legal demand. It was a notice that their loan was now due in full. I had included a copy of the recorded deed of trust. I had highlighted the clause that allowed for acceleration of debt in the event of a change in the primary residence status. I had given them 30 days to pay me $275,000 plus interest. I looked out my new window at the trees swaying in the breeze. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had done my duty as a mother. I had given them every chance to be a family. Now I was doing my duty to myself. I had moved out in silence. But that silence was about to be replaced by the sound of a legal storm they never saw coming. I took a sip of my water and smiled. For the first time in 3 years, I was the one in charge of my own story. They say that the kitchen is the heart of the home. In my son's house, it was where we shared coffee, where Sophie did her drawings, and where I spent hours preparing meals for a family I thought loved me. It was only fitting that the kitchen island would be the place where I left my final message. It was my last day. The movers had already taken my boxes. My car was packed with the last of my personal treasures. The house felt hollow, as if the walls themselves knew that the spirit of the home was leaving. I walked through the rooms one last time. I saw the empty space where my wingback chair had sat for 3 years. I saw the marks on the floor where my dresser had been. I didn't feel sad. I felt clear. I walked back into the kitchen. I took out a large yellow manila envelope. It was heavy. It had the weight of 30 years of professional experience and 40 years of a mother's sacrifice. I placed it right in the center of the granite island. I made sure it was positioned perfectly, so they couldn't possibly miss it when they walked through the door. Inside that envelope was a letter. It wasn't a long letter. I didn't want to explain myself anymore. I didn't want to argue. I just wanted to state the facts. I wrote, "James and Kimberly, I am leaving as you requested. I hope you find the space you were looking for. I hope Mrs. Burbage finds comfort in my room. But you must understand that the $275,000 I paid toward this mortgage was not a gift. I continued. You will find enclosed a copy of the promissory note and the deed of trust that James signed 3 years ago. As I am no longer a resident of this property, and as the conditions of our private agreement have been violated, I am exercising my right to call the loan. The legal language was cold. It was precise. It was undeniable. I had highlighted the section regarding the lien I had placed on the house. I had underlined the part about the 30-day notice. In the eyes of the county recorder, I was the primary lender on that property. If they couldn't pay me back my $275,000 in full, the house would go into foreclosure. I felt a strange sense of calm as I sealed the envelope. I wasn't doing this to be cruel. I was doing this because respect is not a gift. It is a boundary. They had treated me like a disposable object. They had taken my money and then tried to erase my presence. They thought I was a grandmother with no options. They forgot I was a woman with a plan. I took one last look at the kitchen. I thought about the hundreds of meals I had cooked there. I thought about the laughter and the stories. All of that was gone now. It had been replaced by a transaction. I walked out the front door and locked it behind me. I dropped the keys through the mail slot. The sound of the keys hitting the floor was the final punctuation mark on this chapter of my life. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The house looked beautiful in the afternoon sun. It looked like the perfect suburban dream. But I knew the truth. That dream was built on a foundation of debt. A debt that was now due. I turned onto the main road and didn't look back again. I had left the envelope. I had left the keys. I had left the burden of being a neglected mother. Now, I was just Evelyn. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. The first week in my new apartment was a revelation. I had forgotten what it felt like to live without the weight of someone else's expectations. I had forgotten what it was like to wake up in a room that was truly mine. My new place was small, but it was filled with light. I had a little balcony where I could sit and watch the birds in the park across the street. I didn't have to wake up at 6 in the morning to make pancakes for anyone. I didn't have to fold endless piles of laundry that weren't mine. I spent my mornings drinking tea and reading the newspaper. Real paper. Not a digital screen. I enjoyed the crinkle of the pages and the smell of the ink. I went for long walks in the park. I met a neighbor, a lovely woman named Martha, who lived 2 doors down. We talked about books and gardening. She didn't look at me as if I were a piece of old furniture. She looked at me as a person. I felt light. I felt as if a heavy cloak had been lifted from my shoulders. Meanwhile, I could only imagine what was happening at the old house. My phone remained silent for the first 5 days. I knew they hadn't found the envelope yet. They were probably too busy celebrating their victory. I could picture Kimberly and her mother, Mrs. Burbage. I knew exactly how it went. Mrs. Burbage would have moved into my room within hours of my departure. She would have brought her flowery perfumes and her loud television shows. She would have taken over the kitchen, complaining about how I had organized the spices. Kimberly would be happy. She would feel like the queen of her castle again. She would be talking about nurseries and wallpaper for the new baby. James would be relieved. He would be enjoying the silence of his mother's absence, thinking he had managed a difficult situation with logic and maturity. They were living in a bubble of false security. I imagined the moment they finally walked into the kitchen and saw that yellow envelope. Maybe it was a Wednesday. Maybe they had been out for dinner to celebrate. They would see it sitting there, glowing under the pendant lights. James would probably open it first. He would read the first few lines and think it was a thank you note. Then he would see the legal stamps. He would see the words, notice of default. He would see the number, $275,000. I could see the color draining from his face. I could see Kimberly snatching the paper from his hand, her eyes scanning the lines for a loophole that didn't exist. But I didn't let those thoughts stay in my head for long. I didn't want my peace to be poisoned by their chaos. On the 7th day, I went to a local art gallery. I hadn't been to a gallery in years. Arthur and I used to go all the time. But after he died, it felt too painful. Now, it felt like a tribute. I looked at the paintings and felt a deep connection to the colors and the shapes. I felt like an artist myself, redrawing the lines of my own life. I was 72 years old, and for the first time I was completely free. I had my health, I had my sanity, and thanks to my own foresight, I was about to have my money back. That evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the stars come out over the city, my phone finally rang. It was James. He let it ring, and ring, and ring. I wasn't ready to talk to a borrower yet. I was still enjoying being a woman who lived in a house with no whispering walls. I took a slow sip of my tea and smiled. The week of silence had been wonderful, but I knew that the silence was about to end, and when it did, it wouldn't be me who was doing the begging. The weight of their choices was about to settle on their shoulders, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to help them carry it. The silence of my new apartment was broken on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, finishing a crossword puzzle, and enjoying a second cup of Earl Grey tea. My phone, which had been quiet for days, suddenly began to vibrate with a violence that seemed to shake the entire room. I looked at the screen. It was James. I took a slow sip of my tea. I let it ring, and ring, and ring. I wanted him to feel the weight of the weight. I wanted him to understand that my time was no longer his to command. On the fourth call, I finally picked up. I didn't say hello. I just waited. Mom? Mom, are you there? James's voice was unrecognizable. The calm, arrogant tone he had used to tell me I was being rearranged was gone. In its place was a high-pitched, frantic stutter. I am here, James, I said. My voice was as smooth and cool as a mountain stream. Mom, what did you do? He shouted. I could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background. I just got off the phone with the bank. We were trying to open a line of credit for Kimberly's business and the nursery, and they told me they can't. They said there is a cloud on the title. They said there is a legal lien for $275,000. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the blue sky outside my window. That sounds correct, James. Correct? Mom, they said the house is technically in default. They said a notice of commencement of foreclosure was filed yesterday. Kimberly is hysterical. Her mother is crying. We thought you just left a nice letter. We didn't realize you were trying to ruin us. I took another sip of tea. I didn't feel the anger I expected to feel. I just felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The system I had worked in for 30 years was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was protecting the person who had followed the rules. I am not trying to ruin you, James, I said quietly. I am simply collecting on a matured debt. You told me that I was no longer part of the household. You told me that our living situation was being rearranged. When you changed the terms of our family arrangement, you also triggered the terms of our financial arrangement. What are you talking about? He groaned. We're family, Mom. You can't put a lien on your own son's house. People will think you're crazy. Actually, James, I replied, the county recorder thinks I am a very smart woman. They have the promissory note you signed 3 years ago. They have the deed of trust. It is all very legal. It is all very public. And until that debt is paid, you don't truly own a single brick of that house. The silence on the other end was heavy. I could hear him breathing, a fast, shallow sound of someone who has just realized they are trapped. Mom, please, he whispered. The bank said if this isn't cleared up in 30 days, they might call our primary mortgage too because of the cross-default clause. We'll lose everything. Sophie will have no home. The new baby. Kimberly is pregnant, Mom. How can you do this to your own grandchildren? It was the ultimate guilt trip. He was using the children as a shield, just as he had done when he kicked me out. But I had been through that fire already. The children will have whatever home you provide for them, James, I said. Just as I provided a home for you. You have 30 days. I suggest you start looking for a way to pay your debts. Or perhaps you can ask Mrs. Burbage for the money. I hung up the phone. I sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet. My son had called me a stranger. He had treated me like clutter. And now he was finding out that the clutter was actually the only thing holding his world together. It was the sound of a crumbling kingdom. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to run in and try to catch the falling stones. An hour later, the doorbell to my new apartment rang. I didn't have to look through the peephole to know who it was. James didn't wait for me to answer. He began pounding on the wood. "Mom, open the door. We need to talk, now." I opened the door slowly. James stood there, his tie undone, his face flushed. He looked like he had run all the way across town. Behind him, I saw Kimberly sitting in their SUV at the curb, her face buried in her hands. I didn't let him in. I stood in the doorway, just as I had done at his house 3 days ago. "Mom, you have to stop this," he said, trying to push his way past me. I stayed firm. "Kimberly is having Braxton Hicks contractions from the stress. You are literally putting her and the baby in danger. Just sign the release. We'll pay you back eventually. We promise." I looked at him, and I felt a deep, profound sadness. Not for myself, but for him. He still didn't get it. He still thought eventually was a valid form of currency. "James," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet hallway. "Do you remember the night you came into my room and told me I had 30 days to leave? Do you remember how you called it rearranging?" He flinched. "That was different, Mom. We needed the room for her mother. It was a family emergency, and this is a financial emergency," I replied. $275,000. That is the price of the roof over your head. That is the money Arthur and I worked for. You took it with a smile, and then you treated the person who gave it to you like an unwanted guest. I stepped forward, forcing him to look me in the eye. "You thought that because I am your mother, my love was a blank check. You thought you could take everything I had and then discard me when a newer, more convenient family member arrived. You were wrong. So what do you want?" He spat, his desperation turning into anger. "You want us to move out so you can move back in? Fine! We'll kick Mrs. Burbage out. We'll give you your room back. Just stop the foreclosure." I shook my head. "No, James. I don't want that room. I don't want to live in a house where I have to look at the people who were so willing to throw me away. I have a new home now, a home that I pay for with my own money, a home where I am respected." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "What I want is my money back. All of it. $275,000, plus the 3% interest we agreed upon in the note. You have 30 days to refinance the house or sell it. If you don't, the sheriff will be at your door to serve the final papers." "We can't refinance," he screamed. "The interest rates have doubled since last year. And with your lien on the title, no bank will touch us. You're killing us, Mom." "Then you will have to sell," I said calmly. "The market is still good. You'll get enough to pay me back, and maybe have a little left over for a nice 2-bedroom rental, somewhere with a couch for Mrs. Burbage." James looked at me as if I were a monster. He couldn't understand how the soft mother he knew had turned into this woman of iron. He didn't realize that I was simply reflecting the world he had created. He had taught me that our relationship was about arrangements and priorities. I was just following his lead. "You're really going to do this?" he whispered. "You're really going to make us homeless?" "No, James," I said, preparing to close the door. "You made yourselves homeless the moment you decided that your mother was a piece of furniture. I am just the one holding the bill." "I am your son!" he yelled as the door began to close. "And I am your creditor," I replied. The door clicked shut. I walked back to my kitchen and sat down. My tea was cold. I didn't care. I felt a strange, hollow kind of peace. It was the peace that comes after a long, hard storm. I knew what would happen next. They would try to fight it. They would talk to lawyers. But I knew my work. I knew the documents were airtight. There were no loopholes for betrayal. In 30 days, I would have my $275,000 back, and James would have a very important lesson. He would learn that you cannot build a life on the back of someone else's sacrifice, and then kick them when they are down. The price of a mother's love is high, but the price of her betrayal is even higher. I picked up the crossword puzzle again. 20 across. A 7-letter word for justice. I smiled and wrote it down. REVENGE was too short, but RESPECT that fit perfectly. The following 30 days were a whirlwind of noise and chaos, but none of it was mine. From the quiet sanctuary of my new apartment, I watched as the life James and Kimberly had built began to fold like a house of cards. They tried everything to stop the inevitable. James called me every single day, his voice moving from anger to pleading, and finally, to a dull, hollow kind of despair. He told me they had gone to every bank in the city, but the answer was always the same. With a recorded lien of $275,000 and a notice of default on the title, no reputable lender would touch them. Their credit scores, which they were so proud of, began to plummet. The lifestyle they had cultivated, the high-end SUV, the private preschool for Sophie, the expensive club memberships, it was all built on the equity I had provided. Without me as the foundation, the whole structure was sinking into the mud. Kimberly even called me once. Her voice was stripped of its usual sharp edge. She sounded small. She told me about the stress and the pregnancy. She told me that her mother, Mrs. Burbage, was inconsolable because she had nowhere else to go. She actually had the nerve to ask me if I wanted to be responsible for my own grandchildren being born in a rental apartment. I listened to her, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No guilt, no anger, just a deep, quiet realization that these people only valued me when they needed something. I told her that I wasn't the one who had made the choices that led to this moment. I told her that she and James were the ones who had rearranged their priorities, and now they had to live with the new arrangement. By the end of the month, they realized there was no way out. They couldn't refinance. They couldn't borrow their way out of a debt that was legally recorded and secured. They were forced to do the one thing they dreaded most. They put the house on the market. Because of the legal pressure, they had to sell fast. They couldn't wait for the perfect offer. They had to take what they could get to satisfy the lien before the foreclosure went to a public auction. I remember the day the for sale sign went up in the front yard. I drove by once just to see it. I saw Kimberly standing on the porch, her face pale, watching a real estate agent walk through the front door. The very door I had walked out of with my dignity in a suitcase. It was a bitter lesson for them. They had treated my $275,000 as if it were a gift from a tooth fairy. They forgot that in the real world, and especially in the American legal system, a mother's kindness can be legally protected. They sold the house for a good price. But after my lien was paid in full, and after the realtor fees and the closing costs, there was very little left. They didn't walk away with a fortune. They walked away with enough for a security deposit and a few months of rent. The paper palace had collapsed. The perfect life was over. And as the check for $275,000 plus interest was deposited into my account, I realized that justice isn't about being mean. It is about the weight of one's own choices finally hitting the ground. The day the final payment hit my bank account was a Tuesday. I sat at my computer and looked at the balance. $275,000 plus interest. It was more than just a number. It was my freedom. It was the 40 years of work that Arthur and I had done, returned to me in full. I didn't buy a new car. I didn't buy a bigger house. Instead, I did something I had dreamt of since I was a little girl in a small town in Pennsylvania. I walked into a travel agency downtown. I sat across from a young man who looked very surprised when I told him what I wanted. "A world cruise?" he asked. "The full 180-day voyage?" "Yes," I said, handing him my credit card. "The one with the balcony suite. I want to see the fjords in Norway. I want to watch the sunrise in Santorini. I want to see the world that I spent 40 years working to afford." While I was packing my suitcase with linen dresses and sun hats, I heard through a mutual friend about James and Kimberly's new arrangement. They had moved into a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. It was near a noisy highway. Sophie had to share a room with the new baby's nursery. And Mrs. Burbage? The woman who was so important that I had to be kicked out? She was sleeping on a pull-out sofa in the living room. There was no guest wing for her anymore. There was no main floor bedroom with a view of the garden. She was living in the very chaos she had helped create. I didn't feel happy about their struggle. But I didn't feel responsible for it either. James was 35 years old. He was a man. He had to learn that you cannot build your happiness on the bones of your mother's security. The morning I left for the harbour, I took a taxi past my old house one last time. A new family was moving in. I saw a young couple carrying a crib through the front door. They looked happy. They looked like they were starting a new chapter. I whispered a small prayer that they would be kinder to their elders than the last occupants. When I stepped onto the deck of that massive white ship, I felt the salt air on my face and the sun on my skin. I looked out at the vast, blue Atlantic Ocean, and I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than anything I had ever known. I met a group of other retirees on the first night. We sat in the lounge, drinking champagne and sharing stories. I didn't tell them I was a homeless grandmother. I told them I was Evelyn, a retired legal professional who was finally taking her first real vacation. I realized then that my life didn't end when my son betrayed me. It didn't end when I was 68, or 70, or 72 woo. It actually just began. I had spent my whole life looking after others. I had been a daughter, a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. Now, for the first time, I was just me. Sometimes, life has to break you down to the very foundation so you can see what you are truly made of. I am made of iron. I am made of the fine print. And I am made of a spirit that refuses to be silenced. As the ship pulled away from the dock and the skyline of the city began to shrink, I took a deep breath. The past was a closed book. The future was as wide and as open as the sea. I am Evelyn. I am 72 years old, and my journey is only just beginning. As I sit here on the deck of this beautiful ship, watching the moonlight dance on the waves, I cannot help but reflect on the journey that brought me here. It was a journey of pain, yes, but it was also a journey of profound awakening. I want to speak directly to you for a moment. To those of you who have spent your lives building homes, raising children, and sacrificing your own dreams so that others could thrive, we are often taught that a mother's love should be silent and all-enduring. We are told that in our golden years, we should simply be grateful for whatever corner of the house our children decide to give us. But I am here to tell you that respect is not a gift that is handed to you out of pity. Respect is a boundary that you set for yourself. I loved my son with everything I had. I gave him $275,000 because I wanted him to be happy. But love and business are two very different things. Protecting yourself is not an act of malice. It is an act of self-preservation. James learned a very difficult lesson. He learned that the people who carry you when you are down are not meant to be walked upon when you are up. He learned that every choice has a weight, and sometimes that weight is more than you can carry. And me? I learned that 72 is not the end of the road. It is just a new beginning. My life is no longer about folding laundry or waiting for permission to speak. My life is about the sunrise in the Mediterranean and the friends I haven't met yet. It is about the freedom of knowing that I am the master of my own fate. If this story touched your heart, or if it reminded you of the importance of your own independence, please consider liking this video. It helps us share these voices of justice and wisdom with more people who might need to hear them today. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to set a hard boundary with someone you love? Have you ever had to stand up for your own dignity in your later years? Your stories are important, and we value every single one of them. Before you go, do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories about life lessons, family, and the power of standing your ground. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Remember, you are worth so much more than a spare room. You are a lifetime of wisdom. You are a legacy, and you deserve to be treated with the honor you have earned.